everyone, and welcome back to another ID Vibe. I'm Kenna, and I'm here with Alyssa today, and we're going to talk about how we create creative discussion opportunities for students in our courses. Okay, let's jump in. So, first, we want to talk a little bit about what creative discussions are and how you can kind of adjust your process so that it's easier for you to achieve them in your courses. The first thing that I would say is when you go into your course design process, you should probably determine what you want your discussions to achieve. So if it is something that is going to be used just as a way to track attendance to make sure that students are engaged in your course, or if it's something where you really want your students to interact with each other and engage about whatever the topic is or their own experience, then that will really kind of shape what the discussion outcomes are and how you write the discussion questions and prompts and all those things.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Alyssa?
I agree. I think that is one of the first steps is figuring out what your goals are for these discussions. And I know when you're in online school, that can make it a little bit trickier. So I think having that be your first step is a great start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the discussions, at least for us, because we are all online, we're completely online and we're not synchronous, so there aren't opportunities for students to interact with each other. The discussion forum is a great place for students to converse and build each other's knowledge up and learn from each other. So I think that's kind of how we approach it, but I think it does depend on what the situation is for the course that you are building.
hmm
All right. Well, um, what do you think is the next thing that you should kind of consider when going into building discussions?
For me, I think establishing what topics you want before you create all of your questions necessarily. Being able to establish like the general topic of what you want students to know about or discuss. Once you have that, you can kind of start framing your weeks and moving them around to what works best for the course.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think it's good to ensure that whatever the discussion topic is, or whatever you're asking students to do, it lines up with your course objectives, your module topics, and all of the things that the students have been learning. Um, I've definitely had a couple discussions that are a little disjointed that don't seem to match up with what I had been learning at the time, so I think it is important to find that, like, sweet spot of alignment.
hmm
Um, I would agree with that, definitely, like, figuring out the topic, figuring out what the goals are for the discussion, and, we do have a more standardized process here where most of the discussions look the same, so if you don't have that, I would also recommend that where it's, you kind of give students something to go off of. Every discussion is not something that's completely new or different or anything like that. So that would definitely be my tip as well. Make sure that there's like a some consistency across all of your discussions.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Alyssa, do you want to talk a little bit about our approach here?
Yeah, so as Kenna said, our approach, we have I guess a format that we follow. So for the most part, we have our the same headings, discuss, respond, that we follow, which makes it easier for our SMEs, especially if we're working with them more than one course. They start to get the hang of what our process is. So I do like the fact that we aren't changing the format every single course. That also provides students with just some stability in the course. They know what to expect and how to complete different things. So we do work with SMEs, and which those are subject matter experts. And when we're diving into these weeks, I would say my approach with SMEs is different depending on the SME. So some SMEs maybe have their topics and then they might want to they might already know their questions that they want students to cover, or they might have a prompt that they want to introduce first. So I generally let the SME pick what is best for them, and then I build off of that with them. So um, for our questions, we typically don't want to have like a yes or no question. We want something where students can expand on the topic. And we also just want to provide students with opportunities to give their own personal experiences and be able to be vulnerable if they would like to be. So a lot of open-ended questions. And we also have what Kenna has on the screen as CE questions, which are continuing engagement questions. And these questions we have in our documents as, just like it says, questions that would help continue that engagement throughout the discussions. Since we are an online school, we want students to be able to communicate and feel like they're having a discussion. So that is our approach on, rather than having just one response, we really want students to dive in and dive deeper into each conversation throughout the discussion. Lastly, we also have the audio and video on the screen, which this is something we try to incorporate into our discussions and we try to encourage students to do, because this really builds community for the students. When students can see other faces and hear their voices, it really just helps you build a relationship through the screen. So that's something that we try to implement through our process. Do you have anything that you want to add, Kenna?
Yeah, I think you touched pretty much all the bases. As Alyssa mentioned, we do follow a pretty probably a pretty standard format. We usually present the students with any resources that would help them in answering the discussion questions. We present them with a prompt, and in that prompt, we provide context about whatever the topic is and the questions that we're presenting. And then we have two main sections called discuss or respond and then discuss. Respond is the initial response that they will provide an answer for. As Alyssa mentioned, usually they're open-ended questions, much more detailed than something like, what's the definition of this theory?
Mhm.
Or, just something more, something that would ask students to use their critical thinking skills or their problem solving skills a little bit more than just, giving us back a definition or something like that. Because at this point, we're assuming that they already know that. So we have that section, and then in the discuss section, we have questions that they will talk with their other peers about. So it can't usually they're related to the initial response in some way, but they can also be something that's kind of a little bit different, that is a little bit more thought provoking, and they will be able to discuss with each other about it a little bit more. I know
Mhm.
it's kind of tough because we don't have an example up, but we're going to jump to some examples soon. And we could talk a little bit more about that. And then quickly, I just wanted to also touch on the CE questions. Those are continuing engagement questions, as Alyssa mentioned. Those are suggested questions for the instructor to post throughout the week. So usually discussion requirements are make your initial post and then reply to two peers, which is great. But sometimes the conversation may not carry out as you hope. So these CE questions are posted by the instructor throughout the week, and the students also have the opportunity to answer those questions instead or respond to that question instead of what is there or in addition to their other responses. So it's just meant to help continue the conversation and ensure that students are engaged with it and they do have the opportunity to respond to something that kind of piques their interest and that really helps further their learning. So
Mhm.
those questions are usually a little bit more creative too. One example that I have is I was working on a intro to biology course, and the students were discussing some different elements, and one of the CE questions was about life on other planets and whether or not they thought it was possible because of the environment on other planets. So um, like I mentioned, they can be more creative and just give students like the opportunity to use their critical thinking skills and think about things that are a little bit beyond what the regular course content is as well.
Hmm.
Did you have anything else, or do you want to jump into some examples?
We can jump into the examples.
Sounds good. So we do have a few examples here, and this list is not exhaustive by any means. I think that you can go so many ways with discussions. So we just brought some of our favorites here. The first one that we have is ethical considerations. And I think a lot of times um, this can be used if you want to pull in something from the news or something that is kind of a more current event. Um, or even something like a case study. You can present the student with a situation, whatever it is, and ask them to approach the situation from an ethical perspective and kind of explain their own ethical beliefs about it. You could easily bring in morals or a faith-based question here, which is what we do a lot because we are a faith-based university. So I would say that ethical considerations work pretty well in creative discussions, and it really does give students the opportunity to not only expand on what they believe, but discuss amongst each other just, some of the differences in opinions, or if there are the same opinions, then they can give each other feedback on, oh, I like this approach, but I would have done it this way. You might want to consider that. So, yeah, that's just one example. Do you have anything to add about that one, Alyssa?
Um, I think it's just an opportunity, like you said, for students to be able to have a real life discussion feel because that is something that may come up in the real world. And these ethical questions you can place or format as if it was in that field of work or that subject topic to help prepare them for the workplace when that may happen. I think about like in healthcare, you have a lot of different ethical views or ethical considerations, and um, there's different religions that play different roles with different healthcare procedures. So being aware of that is important in healthcare, and I think providing those ethical questions for students to discuss, upon each other is really important to prepare them for the real world.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think these types of questions do really get students in that mindset of, oh, how would I approach this if I was in this situation, or if I was in my career and this situation happened? So, um, I definitely agree there. Do you want to take the next one?
Sure. So decision making for this one, Kenna, were you thinking like how we're providing students the opportunity to make different decisions? Is that your approach with this bullet point?
I would take that approach for sure. Or again, this could be something like a case study where they do have to make a decision.
Okay.
Um, yeah, but I
Yeah,
think
so
there's other ways that you can do this one.
this sounds good. I just want to make sure I was on the same like page as you. So with decision making, this is again, I feel like another opportunity to just prepare students for that real world life scenarios because you are going to be faced with different decisions. So one thing that you can kind of do with this is maybe like a branching scenario sort of feel where the students will see maybe even see the consequences of their own actions or see the outcomes of what they're picking by just providing them that freedom to pick and have that decision. This could be like an example, a real world, like something in the news that's controversial that's occurring that relates to your course, and having students decide like what would be your next step or how would you approach the public with this topic. But providing students the freedom and the independence to feel like they are capable of making a decision, I think is just really powerful for the students.
Yeah, I agree. Another example that comes to mind is I worked on a health management class, and for one of the discussions, we provided fake resumes and asked the students to review the resumes and the job description for a specific position and then decide who to hire. And
Oh, wow.
so then they were able to decide who to hire and then discuss amongst each other, the potential consequences of that, depending on the qualifications and kind of the why behind their decisions. So I think this is another opportunity, like you said, for students to make those connections between here is the choice that I made, here's the potential consequences, and discuss it amongst their peers and see the different perspectives on,
Mm.
whatever the decision was. So I think it's a really interesting way to incorporate it into a discussion forum as well.
Yeah.
All right, so next year we have student experience, and I know this is something that we mentioned earlier. Um, So if the students do want to be vulnerable, of course, I would always add something in the discussion forum, like please only share what you're comfortable with, or something along those lines, since it is more of a public forum where multiple people can see whatever the student has written. So that is definitely a tip if you do decide to go this route. But this would be something where the student would explain their experience with whatever the topic was. Something that comes to mind to me right now because I'm working on this course currently. I'm working on a grief course. It's a psychology course, and in a lot of our discussions, if they are sharing personal experiences or asking people to share about grief or how they process grief or how they've seen others process grief, I think that can be very meaningful because it really allows students to connect and learn from each other because, especially with something like that, it looks different for everyone. But again, it's something that you have the responsibility to, as an instructional designer, to kind of put that out there and make sure that the students know that they should only share what they're comfortable with. So that's what I would kind of caution you with this one. But again, if it's something more light, like I would say that this could be achieved with an introduction discussion forum. So where students introduce each other, answer questions about themselves, or that sort of thing. It's probably okay to approach it that way if it is something that's not as heavy. But again, it's up to you in the situation and the course that you're in.
Yeah, that's so true. You mentioned having it maybe in the first week, and this is something that I've tried out recently. In a criminal justice intro course, we are having students introduce themselves in the video or audio format. And this is one way that we're trying to build engagement and having the students really get to know each other rather than just through text. Um, but with the student experience part, we are encouraging students to share why they're interested in criminal justice and what maybe they want to learn more about. And I think that giving the students that as a question and having them elaborate on it will also help the instructors be able to discuss with the students a little more openly because they know what they're looking for and what they want to learn more about. So you can also ask questions that are a little more that allow students to be a little more vulnerable, and the students will be able to take the route of being vulnerable and being a little bit more vague depending on the situation and depending how they feel, but allowing them to be vulnerable with one another is another way that they're going to be able to build those connections, which I think is really important because a lot of these students, as they're going through their program, they're going to see the same names and the same faces throughout their discussion post and all these on in all these different courses. And I think it's important that they build those connections and they can even remember their peers' names as they move on through all these courses.
I definitely agree. And one thing I want to also just add is I think the term student experience is a little bit broad, and sometimes the questions may not be vulnerable questions for students. You could ask something as simple as like, what are your what is your experience with this topic? Or
Mhm.
um, just asking students to provide more context. We even have in the discuss section, sometimes we'll have students kind of critique each other based on what the initial post was. And something like that, students can really bring in their own experience and say, oh, well, in my career, this may not fit because of X, Y, and Z, or based on my experience, I would have done X, Y, and Z. So,
Mhm.
I think there's definitely a broad range of quote unquote student experience that you can bring into the discussion forum. And I think that it does depend on topic for sure. Alyssa, do you want to take creativity and interactivity?
Yeah, I would. So creativity is important in discussions because it allows students to feel like they have the freedom to show off some of their skills. But it also allows for just a change in scenery and courses. As we said, our discussion formats are always the same style. So being able to change up maybe what they're looking at to discuss on or what they submit for part of their discussion allows students to be more engaged throughout the course. So we have infographics, and sometimes we'll have students, create an infographic on a specific topic that the SME would really like the student to know more about and just explore more. And through these discussions, students can respond to their peers' infographics and learn about how other students approach this is also just a teaching moment for students. So when they have an infographic come up in the future, they're able to kind of take key points from other people and adapt what they made originally. Um, I recently worked on a public health course, and it was kind of like a social media public health course, learning about how to get the word out there about certain health topics. So we have a couple discussions that we formatted for students to imagine it was a social media style post. So they had the option of either creating like a video, which would be like a TikTok or an Instagram reel or a YouTube short, and they would post this, but they would be talking about the topic, and they would respond to their peer as if they were commenting on the post. And this was just to change up the feel of discussions, make it a little bit more fun and engaging because students, a lot of them are on social media or they're at least aware of it. So being able to just provide a different look just changes up the scenery a little bit and allows students to be a little bit more engaged in the topics.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love bringing in these types of creative pieces to discussion forums. I really want to highlight something you said where students are able to learn from each other, which I think is
Mhm.
very true, especially, and these infographics are beautiful. They're reading them all and then responding to each other. I think that is a super awesome opportunity for kind of like community learning and growth. But the other thing is by asking students to actually create something, especially if it's in a course where it's related to what their career is going to be, you're actually giving students the opportunity to create something that they can take with them once they graduate and are in the field, or if they're currently in the field now, they actually have something tangible to share or put in their, portfolio or all of those types of things. And it gives students just more skills, a better skill set. We all know the prevalence of social media and graphics and all of those types of things right now. And by developing those skills now, they will be more equipped once they get to their career, or if they're already in their career now, like I said, they will have those skills readily available and at least partially developed through this. So I think that is a super awesome way to promote engagement and to, like Alyssa said, kind of change the scenery and give students a little something different than a 300 word response or whatever it is.
Yeah,
Can
I think it's so true to like switch it up. I have one more example. And it's from like the student perspective, because I'm also in some courses. So from the student perspective, I recently had a discussion where I needed to create a visual, like some sort of graph or chart to explain data. And then the discussion part was discussing how the data like affected each other and how we can make any changes to it. But having that visual allowed me to understand the data that was being shown to me. So it was definitely a learning moment. And also being able to just go out in the world and create something as simple as a chart. Um, it provides you those little skills that you're going to need in the future that maybe you haven't been asked to do before. So I think having those little key moments in these discussions, whether it's create an infographic or create a chart or create a video, those little skills are going to add up and they'll be able to apply them into the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Um, all right, so next we have case studies, and I think that we kind of already touched on this one with the ethical considerations and decision making, but I think case studies
Mhm.
are a really awesome tool for discussion forums because you could provide the student with a real life scenario that they may actually be in one day. And if you give options for the student to choose from, or if you leave it a little bit more open ended and just ask them to explain how they would proceed or, whatever would make sense for the specific case study, I think that's a great tool to kind of promote the critical thinking and analytical skills and, all of those wonderful things. But then I think that the key for a case study is really the discussion portion because students are able to critique each other, to give feedback, to bring up new perspectives, to just really engage with each other and have that rich discussion and that rich learning with each other just through their responses. And so I really like this tool. I think it's really engaging, and especially if you can bring in media to it or um, eh, and the case studies don't even have to be that complex. I almost feel like the less complex they are, the better answers you get because it puts the responsibility on the student to do some critical thinking there to determine what to do next. So I really like case studies.
I do too. I recently had a case study that we put into a discussion, and what was really fun about it was the instructors kind of got the final ending of the case study, and the students didn't get to see it. So the part of the discussion where the students kind of had to figure out like, well, what happened next? And the instructor had the end of the story, knew what happened next, and they were able to provide it after their initial response to kind of build in that critical thinking. And I guess this also applies to those hypothetical scenarios that we do a lot, which we'll touch on next too. But the hypothetical piece of it, where it's providing students like, well, what happened next? Or what would you do next in this case? Like, if this is all the information you have, what would you do next? So you can also kind of take that approach where the students maybe don't know what the answer is, but that's where you go in and you can respond and provide that additional feedback and provide that final ending.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think that in all real world situations you do have the information that you need to make a good decision. So by putting the students in that position in a safe place where, their choice won't negatively affect anything, I think that that does give them that perspective. And I like what you mentioned too about the instructor having the next piece of the story or the
Mhm.
ending. I think that's a great place for CE questions to come in too, where the instructor could say something like, well, hypothetically, if this happened next, how would that change your initial approach or what would you do differently? So it just really keeps the conversation going as well. Um, and also just to touch on hypothetical situations, it kind of does go a little bit hand in hand with the case study, but if you do present a hypothetical or situation to your student, such as what I mentioned before, if you could live on another planet, what would you need to do first? Or, that kind of situation. It makes the student think outside of the box a little bit more too, which I think is really an interesting thing. And it definitely, I think, helps them make connections between what they've already learned to something bigger than just the content. So I think that's a good tool as well.
Yeah, it really is. And again, this applies to those real world life scenarios. So for me, I reflect on like a health course, and a hypothetical could be like this patient is blood pressure's 120 over 80, which normal, and this one's, 200 over 60. And it's like, well, what would you do? And just giving the students like that choice to discuss like what I should do next. Um, Again, prepares them for the real world without those negative consequences, because what they do in this discussion isn't going to negatively affect that patient. So those hypothetical scenarios really are crucial for learning opportunities.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And overall, I think discussion forums are just a great tool, especially like we mentioned before. If you determine your objectives and what you want students to get out of it, it really does give you a great mindset and framework as you're going into writing out these discussions and making sure that they do have the opportunity to respond to something meaningful and actually discuss with their peers. And, as long as you give them the prompts and the resources and the questions to do that, I think that you really are setting them up for great success in the discussion forums, and they'll be way more engaged as well, instead of just, oh, what's the definition of XYZ? Do you agree
Mm-hmm.
with that? Just those basic questions. They're not going to get a whole lot from that.
Yeah, I also would make the point that with those basic questions, like provide a definition, they one could just look it up very simply, um, and copy and paste a definition down, or a math problem. If you're asking them to like find the mean, median, or mode of something, they can go look that up. So I would encourage you to have those open-ended questions where there's not necessarily a wrong answer, but where you're able to expand on a topic and discuss different options and opportunities between students. And I also would encourage you to really think about different creative ways that you can implement into your discussions. Because as a student, you're going through all these courses for how many years, and it can get a little bit repetitive. So if you can throw in some of these fun, different alternatives, creative not assignments, creative, like different opportunities, and have them have these larger discussions than just a yes or no, it would really encourage students to feel more engaged and that they have the power to make a decision, which also would go to like psychological safety. I feel like that's a big point that discussions can really create if you do it in the right way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And what you said just made me think of one more example that I'll share real quickly. Alyssa and I worked on some course revisions after artificial intelligence tools became a little bit more publicly available for us and students. We actually asked students to use AI tools in our digital marketing program to kind of determine, well, just share their experience with it, whether or not they think it's a good tool for consumers, if it answered the questions correctly, if they think it could replace humans in that specific I guess, profession. It was a chat bot on a couple different shopping websites. So I definitely also encourage you to do that. Look at the actual tools that are being used in that field and see how you can implement them. Of course, there's a risk of the tools becoming obsolete and all of that, but that it's kind of just a risk that you have to take, and it definitely gives the students the opportunity to be on the forefront of their fields and develop the skills and have the tools that they need to be successful.
Mhm.
So, but yes, that was just one more example for you that probably fell a little bit more under student experience. But the sky's the limit when it comes to discussions. What will set students up for
Mhm.
the best success?
Yeah.
All right, so it looks like that's all that we have for you today, but I did want to share two QR codes with you. The first one here is going to be our YouTube channel, and on there you can see all sorts of videos that we've made about these different topics, some other live streams that we have done, and a lot of our instructional media as well. And then the second QR code right here is our OER page. So those are all of our open educational resources. They're free to use to the public. And again, it's just different media that we have created on a range of different topics. This episode was sponsored by the MSIDT program that we have here. If you want some more information, you can scan the QR code on your screen or email us at msidt@lapu.edu. Thank you all so much, and this is what learning feels like.